Well, thanks, Sunil, for the invitation and for the challenge. There was a famous comedian, Shelley Bernstein, I think his name was, years ago, who said, "I've only got a minute, so let's talk about the world." That's sort of the way I feel. I've come a bit late to this climate thing. I have to say spent many, many years at the BIS. And I think we were pioneers, in a certain sense, in saying the central banks have got to get out of the silo, and they've got to start thinking about the implications of price stability for financial stability and vice versa. You know, that these two systems are intimately linked up. I guess what I've come to realize more recently, and that's why I too am not an expert on climate change, is that we don't just have two systems that are interlinked here. We've got at least four. I wrote a piece a little while ago which is called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and which basically was talking about the fact that we've got the economic system, we've got the climate system, we've got the public health system, was worried about pandemics at the time, and of course we've got the political system. And all of these systems are nested within each other. And the point is that whenever you get a problem in one system, you're going to have problems in the other systems. And that is something that I think we need to think about an awful lot more. Gentleman at the back talking about the sand piles. I think we need a fundamental change in the analytical framework used by central banks in particular, where they've thought up until now about the system is linear and it's deterministic. This goes back to something Tim was talking about, you know, DSG type models. It's linear, it's deterministic, it's understandable, and it's controllable. And the problem with all of those postulates is that they're all wrong. Right? The fact is that all of these systems are complex adaptive systems, and they have their own characteristics, which are very, very different from the linear deterministic kind of analytical frameworks that most of the central banks use. So we definitely sort of need to get out of that way of thinking and to start thinking more about the linkages and about how what you do in one area will have an implication for what you do in another area. So for example, I mean, somebody mentioned earlier on today, carbon taxes. Obviously, carbon taxes are a really good idea from the perspective of stabilizing the environmental system. But carbon taxes are also going to give a big impetus to higher prices and the wage price spiral. And that's got a big implication now for the economic system and for the central banks. So we need much more of this kind of systems thinking. And what that means, I think, is that you have to go back to, in order to do that, we're going to have to get rid of a lot of the sort of the beliefs that a lot of people have had up until now. You know, that we really need to take on some of the things that the central bankers in particular would say, and sort of say to them, it's not true, you've got to get out of the silo, you've got to start thinking about the implications of what you do for other systems. And I sort of made a list here of some of the things that, you know, that the central bankers and I guess to a lesser degree the financial regulators believe that isn't true. You know, for example, we're independent and we can't get us drawn into what other people are doing. Well, when you start thinking about independence of central banks, you know, people keep using this term, what exactly does it mean when the mandate is given to them by the government and they're held accountable by the government? So, you know, so they're talking about independence, but in some fundamental sense they've never had it. The idea that near-term price stability is the end-all and the be-all, and we're going to have to pursue this thing resolutely regardless, is not true. I mean, when I think back, and we mentioned this at the BIS back in the 1990s, the whole concept of we're going to maintain price stability and we're going to do everything we can to keep prices up, okay, which is what's been going on for the last 10 or 15 years, without thinking about the fact that the prices actually want to go down because of productivity shocks and all this sort of stuff. And in fact, I think the central banks made a huge set of errors in not responding to positive supply side shocks in the way they should have done over the course of the last 20 years. Because all of that sort of excess credit expansion and all the rest of it has been the root cause of the dominances that we're now worried about in the conduct of monetary policy. Okay? So that we're in a situation now where central banks really have to think seriously about, when we raise interest rates, what does that do for financial stability? Now, there's a problem they've actually created for themselves, but it's a reality at the moment. What happens to financial stability when you start raising interest rates in the current circumstances? These interlinkages are like really, really important, and people have to start thinking about them in a much more serious way. Well, anyway, going back more directly to climate change, I guess the first point that I want to make, and I'll be quite quickly here because I know lunch is coming up. I think the issue of climate change is more important and more urgent than people think. Maybe I'm just saying this coming into it as kind of latecomer, but when you look at the latest IPCC thing, for example, you know, every one of these reports is just sort of getting more and more dangerous. You know, they're seeing more clearly the dynamics, and over time, of course, the time available to use up the carbon budget is getting shorter and shorter. So this creates, to me, it sort of creates a problem, because we've had a lot of talk. Sunil has been leading this, you know, the uncertainty, okay? You start thinking about the stress tests when you sort of get into them, you know, the same kind of thing, incredible sort of degree of uncertainty. And the conclusion is always, we need more research and we need more work. But the point is, we don't have the time to do that work. Right? So we have to fundamentally embrace the concept of uncertainty, and as Sarah said a moment ago, the need to act regardless. The best is often the enemy of the good. So that's one of the things that I think we really have to reflect on a bit. Why should all of these things be of concern to central banks? Well, I think, and regulators, well, I think we've had a very good expression of the various reasons why we should be concerned about it. The identification of risks and trying to know what you can do within the financial system. More broadly, I guess what I've been worried about recently, and I don't think it's getting enough attention, is what are the implications of climate change and other negative supply shocks for the conduct of monetary policy. I think climate change is clearly the most important of these negative supply shocks. But as you start looking at all of the other stuff that's going on, this is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg. I've written a couple of pieces recently that have basically explored the theme of we are going from an era of plenty, which is all the positive supply side shocks that we had, the demographics, globalization, all of that stuff. We're going from that world into a very different world. We're going into an era of shortages. And there's many, many dimensions to it. And maybe this conforms to what you said, Sarah, that, you know, this is one risk amongst many, but it's a really big risk, the climate change thing. But it's one of many. And I'll just sort of list them. So in addition to climate change, we've got all of the pre-pandemic resource misallocations. You know, you want to start thinking about all those companies whose basically business plan was, we're going to get market share and build a moat and be an oligopoly and whatever. Okay, as all that stuff starts to come unstuck, we're going to see that there's been awful lot of capital that's been wasted. The pandemic itself, I think the lingering effects of that, we talk about part rates and supply chain bottlenecks and the need to sort of build in resilience, all of that stuff is going to be more costly. The demographics, my first boss, an old friend, Charles Goodhart, has written a whole book about the great demographic reversal. There's no workers, and there aren't going to be any more workers. That's a big thing. And then the self-inflicted wound, in a certain sense, the geopolitical tensions. So there's going to be, this show is going to run and run in terms of the inflationary implications of what's going on. And I think we have to think very carefully at that point about the whole sort of central banking model that basically says price stability is an end in itself. It is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. Right? The means to the end being what the G20 would describe as strong, resilient, inclusive growth. And so that sort of multifaceted element of it has got to come back into it. And I guess what I'm sort of hoping is that, in a way, climate change, which is really such a big challenge and focuses the mind so much on the uncertainties that are out there, that it might actually prove to be a kind of catalyst that will trigger a change in the analytical approach. You know, it's almost a philosophical question. You know, I'll finish where I started off. If it's all sort of nested, interrelated, complex, adaptive systems, it demands a totally different way of thinking about solutions than if you think it's all linear, deterministic, and understandable and controllable. So those are the sort of the big challenges that we face. And I'm sort of hoping, I mean, this is very much a small silver lining in a very dark cloud, that climate change and the enormity of the challenge, the existential challenge, will actually get people to start and think again. There's some great lines. One of them, I think, is the best of them all, is Oliver Cromwell wrote a letter to the Scottish Presbyterian Synod, in which he said, "Brothers, I beg you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you might be in error." And that's the kind of thinking that I'm hoping that sort of climate change will evoke. That it'll make people start thinking about different ways to confront problems. Business as usual is just, as far as I'm concerned, should be taken right off the table. Anyway, I'm not sure that's a summary or a rant, but in any event, that's where I'm at the moment. So thank you very much.